Chapter 7. How Tercelin the crow, Redbeak the partridge, and Tinker the little sparrow vied with each other in deceiving Reynard. After dragging himself to the bank, onto firm ground, he lay down and closed his eyes. He felt so tired that he had not even the courage to lick his smarting leg. The gash must be bleeding, for Pincher's beak was as sharp as scissor blades. Around him the frogs were croaking, beginning their evening concert. A few drops of rain fell from a heavy purple cloud below, which, on the western horizon, extended a long golden blade of light. Then Reynard let his tongue hang out so that the rain could cool his fever. He stayed there a long time, lying stiffly, half fainting, half asleep. Yet he could still hear the strange voices of the tree frogs which throbbed around him, some tuneful, some hoarse, but all vying with each other in mockery, with the exception of one, which was serious and sweet, and seemed to take pity on the poor wretch. From time to time wings seemed to come and brush against his forehead. Then he opened his eyes and recognised a sedge warbler, a nightjar with a huge beak snapping at the mosquitoes as they flew past, and he slowly closed his eyes again. Anyone seeing him at that moment, covered with mud, the hairs of his coat matted together, his tongue lolling out of his mouth, would have taken him for a dead animal who was already meat for the bluebottles. But in fact he was recovering his strength before going back quickly to the forest trails. More wings flew by, swifter this time, and more daring, for Reynard immediately felt a piercing prick on his tongue, as sharp as the point of a knife. His leap of defence roused him from such an attitude of total relaxation that it looked much more like a furious leap of attack. He almost caught his aggressor. It was Tercelin the crow. He had seen the red tongue hanging out, and he had swooped down on it, his formidable beak outstretched. 2 feathers were torn out of his tail and remained on Reynard's nose. He sneezed to remove them, shaking his head with disgust. "Go to the right," he called out to him. "Go to the right, nighttime enchanter, you vile carrion bird, attacking dying animals." "For someone who's dying," said Tercelin, "you jump very well." And on purpose he flew to the left, alighting buoyantly, flying away when he saw Reynard tense his muscles, mocking him from above and below, while the confused croaking of the frogs round about them grew louder and louder. "I'll remember this," said Reynard. And he turned his back on Tercelin. The crow spread out his wings as he hovered over the fox, just long enough to send down onto him a stream of warm, white droppings, branding a scar across his nose. "That's for your moustache, Reynard! I'll see you tomorrow!" And he flew away to the left. The next day, Reynard... But how is it possible to describe that day? That day that was as black as Tercelin the crow, the worst day he had ever lived or was to live through during the whole of his long life, for on that day he drank the dregs. Ermelyn had comforted him and licked the mud from him with her soft tongue. Lying by her side in the comfortable warmth of the earth, surrounded by the squeaking of their 3 cubs, he had half forgotten his torment and his enemies. But they clung to him as vermin clings to fur, ticks to dogs, and misery to the wretched world. He went out with the dawn in order to surprise Redbeak the partridge in his night resting place. The fine rain of the previous day was no more than shining dew. The day was full of promise beneath a silken June sky. At this moment the birds were waking up. The blackbird was whistling, the tit was cheeping, and the owl was coming home to Malpass. Lanfert was sharpening his axe, while Outram Rufus was harnessing Constant Denoir's oxen. Soon now the artful Bronwyn and Julia the pastor's wife would go down to the river, and the Tyrone monastery bell would ring out to wake the monks who were still snoring. In this way all these people, without knowing it, would soon be taking a road that led them towards Reynard, and Reynard did not know it either, but Tercelin, the crow of ill omen, knew very well the preparations he had made against his enemy the fox. Who loved Tercelin in the forest? Nobody. And in the great clearing of mankind? Nobody. It is customary to deflect blows onto weaker or more unfortunate people. When the devil's bird, the sorcerer of the fields, had seen Reynard the evening before, mud-stained and his paw red with blood, he had ceased to be afraid of him, and at dawn that day he perched on a rowan tree to watch for him and surprise him as he left Malpas. When he had seen him confidently leave the hole concealed beneath the brambles, sniff the wind and break into a trot, he flew as fast as he could to the plain at the forest edge, pink-tinged with heather, sparkling with dew, where Redbeak and her sisters were sleeping. He called out something to Redbeak and flew back again to the forest, always going higher than the tops of the oak trees, but plunging beneath the leaves in the glades, the coppices and the thickets, hovering on his great wings from nest to nest, cawing quietly as he went along. And after that he reached the plain. He wheeled round above the houses, round the dovecote of Constantinois Garth, and all the time he cawed in the same harmless way, so softly that it was wonderful to see how much disturbance he caused all round. Everywhere there were bird calls, the fluttering and soaring of wings. The willow warbler from the tall trees, the hedge warbler from the orchard, the bullfinch and the blackbird from the hedge, and the sparrow from the fields all came flying towards the heather-pink moor at the forest edge, hiding in the thick leaves and the undergrowth in the ditches. Reynard was down there, behind the clumps of gorse. He did not look as discomfited as Tercelin seemed to say, for his eyes were bright and his face fresh. With folded paws and his belly close against the grass, he glided from tuft to tuft, pausing between his smooth, low leaps. It was enough to follow his tense arrow-like gaze to discover Redbeak the partridge and her sisters in the heather. Had Tercelin warned them? Did they know that the bird-slayer, the patient, bloodthirsty fox, was lying in wait and gradually coming closer? Many little hearts, beneath their brightly coloured crops, were beating wildly or sinking in anguish. Reynard stopped again. His savage eyeballs, so wide and burning, met the partridge's eye, a black pearl in a white setting, and immediately he turned to stone, lying as close to the moorland soil as a rock beneath its rust-coloured lichen. His eyelids with their stiff lashes were lowered, veiling the fire in his eyes. A great silence brooded over the moor. The sun rose in the sky. All the birds watched from their hiding places, and they all saw what had never been seen before in the forest or on the moor, for Redbeak the partridge was going towards the motionless Reynard. She walked with firm steps, her head high, holding a long grass stalk, as downy and soft as a bird's feather, tightly in her beak, and suddenly, half jumping, half flying, she passed over Reynard, and the stalk she was carrying brushed against his whiskers. Oh, a long shuddering murmur ran through the thicket. Reynard the fox, who had been as still as stone, leapt vertically up into the air and turned round in the midst of his leap, hoping to seize Redbeak in his jaws. The snap of his jaws as they closed on emptiness could be heard everywhere. What was he doing? He lay down, rolled softly from one side to another, and waved his tail gently. And Reynard leapt again, smacking his chops and clicking his teeth on emptiness. Then along the hedgerow and in the oak trees the birds began to laugh. "Well done, Redbeak! The fox has been tricked!" Then Tercelin the crow, swooping down suddenly from the clouds, cawed at the top of his voice. "Put your tail between your legs, Reynard! They're coming!" "Hew, hew!" cheeped the tits. "The hounds!" cawed Tercelin. Whistled the blackbirds. "Ear, ear!" cried the magpies. "Arr, arr!" shouted the jays. Reynard shivered all down his spine, as though his body were suddenly bloodless, and at the same time he lost his head. Not that he took flight when he heard the jeers. Both Heaven and Ermelin would have wished him to have more shame. On the contrary, a furious rage seized him and forced him to be defiant. Like all other mad creatures, he thought he could keep his sang-froid and control himself. Alas, the contrary was the case, as he was soon to know. "The hounds," he said. "I don't believe it. I've a good ear and I can hear nothing except these wretched, noisy birds. Take this, Redbeak, you poor silly thing. I missed you again. No, you can't tickle my whiskers and hope to escape. I'll have your blood and make an example of you. What of it, you others? I'm Reynard, do you hear? Reynard! Reynard!" And the birds laughed even more heartily, vying with each other as they repeated, Reynard! Reynard! As though the word had been a snub, a mocking insult, or an expression of contempt. Where is he? Said a tiny voice. There was a buzz of little wings, and a brown bird alighted 2 feet away from the fox. It was Tinker, little Tommy Tinker, the sparrow, the friend of the farmyard and the roof, who nested below the rafters and played round the horse's legs. Reynard raised his paw, hoping to gash him with his toenail, but he was surrounded with a noisy cloud, a whirlwind of beating wings, which left him dazed and suffocated. "Make room for me," Tinker was saying. "This fox is mine. I'm small. I'm the smallest of you all. Is this the terrible Reynard? He's only clad like Reynard. The fur's worth more than the animal. Make room, I tell you. Stand away, everyone." And perching 2 feet away, puffing out his chest and raising his beak, as valiant as Amadis of Gaul, and prouder than proud arm, he sang out, "It's up to us, Reynard.